Hello, WorldCiv107. Welcome to week 3. And I just want you to know that I really paid close attention to a lot of your discussions and looked at your video notes. And I'm going to jump in some of those discussions, but ultimately there were so many things that I felt like I needed to address that I just wanted to say and regarding what you were learning. So we were focusing on some Islamic nations, and we learned some interesting things that one could call somewhat positive, and we learned some negative things such as the Devshirme system, which also many of you saw as kind of a confusing thing. Kidnapping kids, slavery, and then making them elites and giving them a great life compared to other people. That's a hard set of weird circumstances to process into some sort of moral or ethical way, and rightly so. And this is so what we historians deal with all the time, is we look at different civilizations and we're seeing a lot of things that are very negative and very positive. What I want you to always be aware of is that this is what you're going to experience with every civilization we cover. And if you take classes from me, you will go through a roller coaster ride of trying to decide sometimes what you think about certain civilizations. I mean, U.S. history. When I do teach 101, I call it, I title US 101, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the good. I go through the process. That's a play off of a cowboy movie. It used to be the good, the bad, and the ugly. But it's a lot of mixed things. And you look at different civilizations and you see a lot of mixed things. And so that's kind of really something that I just want you to realize for the rest of your life. And so when you look at, because first of all, I just want to say again, when you take a civilization, and we're covering religion in this class, you have the ideals of the religion, and then you have the people in power that use that religion for things that a person might take pride in or shame. But you ultimately have no choice in it, right? And the official ideas don't often always translate into what happens in practice, like I talked about, right? So when it comes to issues of tolerance and war, and you look at, especially it's a topic now, Islam versus Christianity and Judaism, let's say, it's a mixed bag. And you look at Western civilization, they were killing each other all the way from thousands of years ago all the way up until World War II. Okay, that's the legacy of Europe, and so we shouldn't be surprised to see that other civilizations that also sometimes claim. I mean, keep in mind, World War I and World War II was fought mainly by nations that even had monarchs sometimes that were related to each other, that shared same religion and some of the same intellectual and political traditions. Europeans were more closer to each other and still are than, let's say, other cultures. And yet it never stopped them from killing each other, right? And so is that something we blame on religion, or is it blamed on nationalism, or whatever? Like, there's all these different things, right? And so just keep this in mind. Now, I want to recommend a book. And this book is called Under the Crescent and Cross, The Jews in the Middle Ages, Mark R. Cohen. I recommended this before. I think I even put this in one of my lectures, if not here, another spot. But this is a great book, and especially if you look at the beginning part where the author does myth and counter myth. And what is he talking about? There has been historians that try to prove that Jews, in this case, this is very specific to the Jewish experience, have always been oppressed by Muslims, or that they've never been, and compared to Christians. So it's this extremely two different kind of narratives where you're trying to prove that life for Jews under Muslims has always been this horror story, or has been perfect. And what the author does is show that that's not the case, but that if you look at the Middle Ages and you compare it to Europe, yes, Jews did better over the span of time relatively compared to Europe, being in Europe. while they're living in Islamic majority countries. And he does this in a way that's very nuanced, and he makes a pretty strong case for this argument. Now, modern times created a lot of difference in things. So there's something that I wanted to point out. And this was mentioned by one of my Assyrian students here in the class. You'll have noticed if you looked at one of the comments, excuse me, is that the Ottoman Empire and the Turks end up becoming, and this is still a hot controversial topic, accused of genocide against Armenians and Assyrians. And this happens in, especially in the 20th century, early 20th century. And this genocide, the Turkish government still denies happens. They will not call it genocide. And Armenians and Assyrians have been wanting to get reconciliation. They basically are saying this is like the Jews in Nazi Germany, and this should be acknowledged by the world, and the government needs to apologize and make some concessions in some way to these communities. Now, I won't spend all the time on that now because I think we're going to have a chance to go over that a little bit more later when I cover the modern Middle East and we go over that. But my point is that recent history, which is very, very painful and creates a lot of passionate feelings towards the Christian minorities in the Middle East, in particular Armenians and Assyrians, has overshadowed the better legacy of the Ottoman Empire in terms of its relations to those communities compared to what it was before. So what I'm saying is modern history is proving to show things more negative. Same with the Israel-Palestine conflict, which we'll go over. That now you look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, and both sides will kind of make an argument that Jews and Muslims have always like there's no way to make things work out. And the reality is that there was a different history prior to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Things were better, and it also varies in different parts of the Muslim world. But ultimately, that has created a grotesquely terrible relationship with Jews and Muslims, and it creates a lot of problems. Not universally, but it's definitely led to a serious problem. And I covered the Shiite-Sunni split. Same thing, as you were seeing if you looked a little bit further, that not all Sunnis and Shiites have problems, but it's a historic division that political leaders that want power play off of, and terrorist groups and extremist groups and all that. So we've talked about that. And so, and briefly, I just want to say a few things about Shiites that to help you out, a little bit of clarity of difference. It's not just that the differences are based on the political perspectives about who should have power. There are certain practices that Shiites do that are very foreign to Sunni practice. So, for example, most Muslims think that Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, is such a perfect emulation of God's will. They will always say, Muhammad salallahu alayhi wasallam, or Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. He's given this special reverence, and there is a tradition in one of their hadiths that Muhammad was given as a mercy to the world by God as an example, and he's the perfect example of following Quranic principles. And for the Shiites, their imams, the leaders that are from the house of the Prophet that come afterward, are also considered to be perfect emulations of for people to follow, and gives them almost like a divine-like status in the minds of Sunnis, which they consider to be really blasphemous, actually, or certainly not a place that those imams should be in. That they're on par with Muhammad, and maybe even something bigger than that in the minds of Sunnis. So that's one serious division that they have. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest, is that approach to looking at the imams. And then they have what are called like marjas, or I think it's called mutaqlim. I'm trying to think of the word, where you have an ayatollah, And the Ayatollah is believed to be so imbued with a knowledge of the Quran and the Hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and the sayings of the Imams, that you can ask them anything and they know the answer. Like, you can ask them, should I quit my job or not? And the Ayatollah can say yes or no. And that's all you need to hear. They don't need to quote the Quran or the Hadiths. And they kind of get like these almost cult-like presences. If you look in Iraq, Ayatollah Sistani is one of the most popular and largest Ayatollahs. Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran was the guy who had a lot of influence and power and then took political power in Iran, which we will learn about that more later on in this class. And he did something unprecedented, which is actually took complete power of the country, which was never done in Islamic history. And again, we will talk more about this later, okay, when we cover the modern Middle East, which comes at the end of this class. So, you know, you're going to learn about these variations. So, when I say variations of tolerance and not tolerance and good or bad, and we have a lot of students in our class that are immigrants, and some might even be refugees that have been dealing with some of these unresolved problems that are still going on in the Middle East. So, the history we just covered, on one hand, you could say that the Islamic world was much more progressive and closer to the values that are happening now. But if you took those values from then and apply them now, those are considered not progressive, right? So, the treatment of minorities in the Islamic domains was better than how minorities were treated in Christian kingdoms, but none of those regimes do what we would consider in the modern Western world now an equal rights civil society where people all get to do freely, like those ideals that we say we believe in, and so forth. So that's mainly what I just wanted to say on that. If there's any more questions, or if you feel offended, bothered, or you heard something that you think contradicts what I've discussed in this announcement or in the information, please, that we covered, please hit me up and let's go over that. I think these are very important topics in a time like that we're living right now. And just one last thing I'll say, and we're going to also try to cover this a little bit later, is that currently in India there has been a rise of Hindu nationalism that many critique as being a type of fascism that's very, very anti-Muslim, and looks at the history we just covered as a kind of justification to discriminate against Muslims. That's not how all Hindus see it. Some see it as their kind of right to defend themselves. But ultimately, if you look at it from a bird's eye point of view, there is a strong kind of Hindu chauvinism that's been taking place within India in the modern times, to the point that there's even groups of vigilantes called cow protectors, because the cow was sacred in Hinduism, but it can be used as food in Islam. And they go around and they see if any Muslim butchers have killed a cow, and if so, they enact physical violence or do something to punish those butchers. And it's really a way to kind of keep the Muslim minority in their place. From an outsider's perspective, that's what it looks like. And so this is unfortunate. But, here's the other thing I want to remind you, and we're going to go over this again as well, and this is my last thing I'm going to say. In Myanmar, currently at The Hague, there's a trial that's accusing the Buddhist majority government of committing a genocide and rape and violence and all sorts of terrible things against a Muslim minority within Myanmar. So even Buddhism can face a criticism about some of the behaviors that we see in these time periods and some of the more negative aspects of war and lack of tolerance within other parts of the world now. Okay, so what I'm hoping is that to be positive coming out of all this is that you're going to be more balanced in how you look at things, and that you will not be tricked into people who try to use history to focus on it in a very narrow way blindside you from looking at a broader scope to then make you kind of be a product of this sectarianism, hatred, phobic view about X, Y, or Z people and civilizations. Okay, so, and that's all I got to say. I'm sorry I took so long on this, but I do think this is important right now. Like I said, contact me if you need anything. Have a great week.